Hold on, brother. The commander of the Blades pressed his unshaven cheek against him, then stepped back, gave him a pat on the shoulder, and tried to meet his eyes. The departing fighters left him a few grenades and full magazines, shook hands with guilt, avoiding eye contact, understanding that they would not see him again in this world. Finally, the farewell was over, and the unit transporting the wounded departed through the pass. Jirsa still had a lot to do. He began stacking stones and piling them onto the parapet, leaving a gap wide enough for shooting. When he finished, he took his beloved Tonto knife from its sheath and placed it nearby. He thought for a moment, then did the same with his pistol. He smoked a little, brushing the ash on his sleeve, realizing that nothing would change now. He began scanning the surroundings with binoculars. There was no other path through the pass. This was the route they would take, and they would meet him here. Jirsa smirked with disdain. Life was miserable, perhaps the end would be worth it. After half an hour, he spotted scouts, 3 figures, completely at ease, barely attempting to conceal themselves as they descended the trail. Confident that they had nowhere to run, Jirsa gently squeezed the trigger as he'd been trained. A short burst from his rifle broke the silence. 2 figures dropped as if they'd hit an invisible wall, while the third staggered backward, shouting something guttural. The enemy took cover and opened intense return fire. Bullets zipped overhead, striking rocks and scattering granite fragments around him. Jirsa fired single shots, carefully conserving ammunition, but the enemy quickly understood the situation and spread out across the terrain, hiding behind large rocks. Their suppressive fire kept Jirsa pinned, unable to raise his head. Several projectiles struck near the gap in the parapet. Looks like they've focused their attention here, he thought briefly. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a bearded figure aiming a grenade launcher. Without hesitation, Jirsa pulled the pin and threw a grenade. It landed near the bandit. An explosion followed, then silence. Jirsa knew it wouldn't last long. The bandits would regroup, and everything would start again. I wonder if our guys made it to the helicopter, he thought. One thing he understood was to hold the line as long as possible and, most importantly, not die too soon, otherwise, it would all be in vain. Twilight gradually descended over the mountains, darkening faster than in the plains. Jirsa could barely make out his enemies now. It seemed they were trying to surround him, hesitating to launch a final attack. Finally, they moved, advancing in short sprints to get closer to the trench, tightening the noose. They were less than 100 meters away. Jirsa responded with short bursts, trying to keep them behind the rocks for as long as possible. Eventually, he used his last grenade. A sharp pain shot through his head. He wiped it away with the palm of his hand and lay on his back. Loading the last magazine, he looked up at the starry sky, which seemed to observe him silently, forming random constellations. Tears welled up in his eyes for some reason. Men don't cry, he thought. At least no one can see me now. Jirsa turned onto his stomach again and pressed his face to the sight of the LCMs. One by one, he pulled the trigger, watching as the enemy numbers dwindled under the loss of blood. His head began to spin, and his strength waned, but he didn't allow himself to relax. When the ammunition ran out, holding a knife in his left hand and a pistol in his right, he rose for one last attack. The helicopter crossed the border. The fighters leaned against its vibrating hull, unsure if Jirsa, who had covered their retreat, was still alive. But dozens of kilometers away, in the distant mountains, gunshots could still be heard. As I entered the reception area, I caught the glance of the secretary out of the corner of my eye. She quickly stood up from behind her desk and planted herself in the doorway. Samantha had asked not to let anyone in. She almost stretched out her arms, trying to block my way. Switching the folder to my left hand, I made a calm gesture toward her well-groomed figure with my right. "It's okay, Veronica. This doesn't concern you." I pressed the handle and pulled the door open. My wife jumped up from the sofa by the wall, hurriedly trying to button her blouse. The burly man to her right didn't move an inch, maintaining his insolent smile as he continued to stare at me. In general, it was a perfect scene. "What are you doing here?" "I told you," she began, taking a deep breath, "not to let anyone in." I figured that didn't apply to me. The man by the wall adjusted his jacket and headed for the door. "Samantha, we can talk later," he said with a triumphant smile. "I'll be waiting for your call." The playboy ignored me completely, as if I were nobody, and left. My wife collapsed into her chair. "Why are you barging into my office without knocking, Samantha?" She tried to regain control of the situation. "You're undermining my authority as a manager. And fooling around with another guy during work hours doesn't undermine your authority." I stood in front of her, trying to process what had just happened. "By the way, I brought you the quarterly report," I added. Was it absolutely necessary to storm into my office like that? Samantha now used her usual commanding tone. "By the way, I have questions for you. Your performance has dropped to almost half over the past few months. I can't tolerate this situation any longer. Performance like this warrants dismissal. The best defense is a good offense." She had shifted the topic. Samantha had finally regained her composure, realizing her submissive husband wouldn't cause a scandal. "So, what's it going to be? Fire me, then. Should I write a resignation letter myself, or will you dismiss me under some article?" My anger was rising. "You'd feel freer with your lovers." Her face flushed. "Get out of here. Your dismissal order will be ready today. And don't bother packing your things, my driver will bring them to you," she said, standing up and brimming with anger. "We'll talk about our future at home." I shrugged and left. After all, I'm a coward. That's how it feels to be under my wife's thumb, politely smiling at her admirers. As I passed the bewildered secretary, I left the reception area. I didn't have many personal belongings in the office, so I quickly packed them into a box. Putting on my coat, I headed for the exit. "Where are you going?" my boss asked, looking confused. "Home. I don't work here anymore," I replied with a polite smile, waving goodbye. "Wait, you can't. There are so many orders and pending clients. They'll leave if you go." My boss stammered, trying to stop me. "It's not a big deal. You'll manage," I said, opening the doors and stepping into the hallway. The employees passing by looked at me with pity. The news of my dismissal had spread quickly throughout the office, giving everyone something new to talk about. At the security desk, I handed my access card to the guard and stepped outside, enjoying the slightly fresh air of freedom. "Have you lost your mind, Samantha? Firing your own husband?" Elena Prokofyeva practically jumped out of her chair. "And what will your father say?" "Oh, Elena, he won't say anything. I think my dad can see for himself who I married. He's a coward through and through. Any other man would have caused a scene, maybe even gone after Badim," Samantha said, her face even flushing with righteous anger. "And this one just stood there, staring at the ground, mumbling something. Is he even a man? Samantha, don't you have children?" "No, then why provoke your husband like that?" Elena's tone was sharp, even making her forget her coffee. "He's a handsome guy. Trust me, there'll be women lining up for him soon." "Elena, please," Samantha said dismissively. "Who would want him, though?" "Well, I don't know, but don't regret it later, Samantha. By the way, are those his children?" Elena Prokofyeva asked, glancing pointedly at Samantha. Samantha stayed silent, pretending not to have heard the question. Uncomfortable questions like that had to be ignored. "Definitely." Elena, meanwhile, thought her own husband was a treasure, always at home, taking care of the kids, hardly drinking, adoring her, and yet she couldn't seem to find her place. "Well, dear, I must go. Lots of work waiting for me," Elena said, standing up and kissing her friend on the cheek. "Goodbye for now." Samantha's phone started ringing. It was her father. She frowned in annoyance as she answered. "Hello, Dad. How are the contracts coming along? Did he bring them to you?" Her father went straight to the point. "By the way, he did great. He convinced Bob, he's ready to work with us. He just wants John to evaluate all the risks and get in touch with him tomorrow. Be nice to your husband tonight, okay? I'm organizing a small party to celebrate the deal. I hope you both can come. There'll be good meat and wine. Looking forward to it." Her father laughed and hung up. "Damn," Samantha muttered under her breath. She realized that after what had happened in her office, her husband wouldn't accompany her anywhere. His Highness was offended. Wasn't I the one who had him under my control? Samantha thought as she called for her car. Leaving the company to its fate, she headed home to resolve the situation. "Are you going to your father's party, Samantha? You must be joking. Take Bedim with you, especially since you've been flaunting him so openly." I stood with my back to her, focused on pouring bourbon into a glass. I watched the light play off the rich color of the drink, then took a slow sip, swallowing even the ice. Honestly, I didn't understand anything about bourbon, but I had to maintain appearances. "Stop saying nonsense. Bedim is just our business partner, there's nothing between us, and there never could be." "I only love you," Samantha said, her words strangely ambiguous. "My father insisted we attend. He wants to talk to you," she added. Samantha kissed me on the lips, simulating a passion that felt far from genuine, and left to change. I stood there for a while, lost in thought, before heading to the bathroom to shave. As I passed our bedroom, I heard my wife's soft voice through the slightly ajar door. She was speaking on the phone, trying not to draw my attention. "Yes, everything's fine. He's not the jealous type. Definitely, come. We'll have time," she giggled softly. "Of course, only your kisses." I quickly walked to the bathroom. When we arrived, the party was in full swing. It gets dark early in October, so the lawn in front of my father-in-law's house was lit with colorful lights. For a while, Samantha and I pretended to be a loving couple, mingling with the guests. Then her mother called her away. I wandered over to a group of men gathered around the grills. The aroma of roasted meat filled the air. From a distance, I heard a familiar voice. "She's quite a catch. We're going to accomplish great things together," Bedim said, laughing as he recounted a story to a group of men seated on the sofa. "And her husband?" someone asked. "Oh, the husband's a loser. He can't even compare to us," Bedim replied smugly. "You should see that idiot." I stood behind him, listening carefully. "She's just the kind of woman we need, the way she makes sounds when she," Bedim continued, showing off. In that moment, I thought, he doesn't even realize who Samantha's involved with. The laughter died down, and everyone turned toward me. "Oh, the loser," Bedim sneered with a smirk. "Where's your little wife?" Her mother called her away to talk. Embarrassed murmurs followed. "And who are you talking about now?" I asked. "About her, of course, my dear," Bedim laughed, but the men around him didn't join in. A threatening silence settled over the group. The dean was visibly startled by this sudden turn of events. He looked at me, but it was too late to back down. I was losing face. "Call her here. Tell her I'm inviting her," Bedim said, shoving my shoulder. Everything happened very quickly. There was a loud crack as I struck him. Bedim, clumsily trying to shield himself with his hands, suddenly fell onto the hot grill. His right cheek touched the hot metal, and the distinctive smell of burnt flesh filled the air. He stayed motionless for a moment, his cheek scorched, before clumsily collapsing onto the damp evening grass. A few people rushed to help him. In the dim light, his bright red cheek was clearly visible. Nobody understood what had happened. Everyone began shouting at once. "Call an ambulance!" I yelled louder than the others. "Yes, Poor Bedim, instant karma had caught up with him. 2 injuries at once, a broken arm and a burned cheek. I couldn't help but wonder which hand he'd been using to hold on to his arrogance that I left the party before it ended, my tires crunching over brick debris as I pulled up to an abandoned workshop. That night, I decided not to sleep at home. The bankrupt metal construction plant on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a birch forest, was something I had purchased from the city council at a ridiculously low price. It was solely my acquisition, neither my father-in-law nor my wife knew anything about it. Only a handful of people who had helped me renovate the factory knew about the place. I hadn't restored the entire factory, just the second floor of the assembly workshop. I'd invested some money to transform the relatively intact part of the building into a comfortable living space. I installed surveillance cameras to monitor practically the entire perimeter of the plant. I also connected cameras installed in my home, in the bedroom and the living room. When I set them up, I hadn't suspected my wife's infidelity. I installed them just in case. I couldn't have imagined the case would come up so soon. I wondered how long she'd been flirting with that fool. 6 months? A year? Well, it didn't matter. The most important thing now was to execute my plan and then surprise my beloved wife. Why feel sorry for her? For now, I would play the fool. The quarters occupied the entire second floor of the abandoned workshop. I pulled a half-full bottle of vodka from an old fridge and poured myself a third of a glass. Spearing a pickled cucumber with a fork, I thought, this is what I need, not that stinking Irish whiskey. Pouring another glass, I activated the alarm system and reclined on the sofa. I needed rest. Today had been anything but easy. I had lived in a happy family for 5 years. That was exactly how long it lasted until the tragic incident that turned my life upside down. It was the day my father died in a car accident and my mother mourned briefly, but it turned out she already had someone else in her life. A year and a half later, she married that man, Vasca. My twin sister and I, 1 boy and 1 girl, were separated. My mother took Inga, my sister, and left with her new husband, leaving me in the care of my grandmother. I lived with my grandmother for about 3 years until her death. At her funeral, my mother appeared, dressed elegantly. She quickly sold my grandmother's apartment and sent me to an orphanage. By then, I was 8 years old and fully understood what was happening. My mother occasionally visited, bringing my sister, who acted distant, as if she were some kind of princess. I had no desire to show her any sibling affection either. Let them take her. Let her suffer. That thought stayed with me forever. One memory that stands out is of a little girl dressed like a princess, eating candy, calling me a beggar. The disdain in her eyes as she threw a piece of candy at me was unforgettable. "Eat this, beggar," she sneered. After being left at the orphanage, my mother and sister disappeared quickly, leaving me utterly alone in the world. I won't go into the details of my life there. It had its ups and downs, but one thing I learned early on was this: if you don't protect yourself, no one else will. I learned to fight for my survival with my fists during my time in the orphanage. My mother never visited me, not even once. It seemed she had more important things to do. After finishing the 11th grade, I enlisted in the army. Service came naturally to me, and after a year, I enrolled in a military academy. During my service, I was deployed to conflict zones in a collapsing country and world. During one operation, I suffered a head injury. While the wound itself wasn't life-threatening, it left my face disfigured. The state financed multiple reconstructive surgeries, which completely changed my appearance. Even my voice became deeper and more masculine. When I looked at myself in the mirror after the final surgery, I was surprised to find that I liked what I saw. A strong, rugged man who had taken life by the horns stared back at me. Perhaps that was when the plan began to form, a plan for revenge against the heartless woman who had abandoned me and her progeny. I didn't know exactly what I would do or how I would achieve it, but I was certain my revenge would be terrible. No, I had no intention of taking anyone's life. I simply wanted to make her existence as unbearable as mine once was. When my contract ended, I was discharged. They shook my hand, pinned a medal on me, gave me a certificate of honorable service, and promptly forgot about me. By then, my emotional pain had dulled, and I didn't bother seeking out my mother or sister. Let God be their judge that I found work as a mechanic at a service station. Starting as an apprentice, I became a full-fledged auto mechanic. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough. In the fall, I began studying at a technical university. Studying came easily to me, especially with my engineering background. Some of my prior experience earned me credits, and within a year, I became a teacher. 2 years later, the shop's owner offered me a partnership in the business. Everything was going well. At a colleague's birthday party, I met Samantha. She was sweet, shy, moderately beautiful, and moderately refined. I courted her for nearly 6 months until, to my surprise, I realized I was in love, so much so that I couldn't imagine my future without her. She introduced me to her parents. Her father owned a construction company, so my future wife was accustomed to a comfortable life. I didn't hide the fact that I had grown up in orphanages. Her parents frowned, murmuring their disapproval, but they didn't oppose their daughter's choice. Before New Year's, we got married. 9 months later, our son was born, and 3 years after that, our daughter arrived. By the time I turned 30, I had become a handsome man. Walking through the city, I often caught the admiring glances of young women, but I loved my wife deeply. Over time, that love only grew. It's curious how that works. The longer you live with someone, the more intertwined your lives become. I loved my wife so much that I would have given my life for her, and those weren't just empty words. Nearly 8 years passed before I began to notice changes in my wife. Gradually, everything started to shift. Suddenly, I became a failure in her eyes, worthless and incapable of providing for my family. I worked as the co-owner and deputy manager of the service station, and my income had always been sufficient. But now, everything had changed. When I came home, the hum of her discontent was constant, and the psychological manipulation began. That was when the abandoned factory came into play. I started spending more and more time there, still unaware of my wife's infidelity, until one day, I saw it with my own eyes on the monitor screens. Not only did I see it, but I also heard her speaking about me. A year earlier, her father had hired me to work at his company. That's how I ended up under the direct supervision of his deputy, who was also my wife. She had finally placed me entirely under her control. I signed contracts, transferred money, bought equipment, all while working primarily for myself. I had my own motivation. In that family, everyone seemed to value one another only as a means to an end. That was when my plan resurfaced, and nothing could deter me from the path I had chosen. I prepared my escape routes with almost sadistic pleasure, intending to leave a trail of destruction behind me. I played the fool so convincingly that everyone believed it, especially my unfaithful wife. To start, I opened false accounts in offshore banks, periodically redirecting money from my father-in-law's company. No one took me seriously, assuming I was incompetent. This operation remained under the radar for some time. A few years after getting married, a former service colleague had offered me an interesting job abroad in my original field of expertise. At the time, I rejected it because I was at the peak of happiness. Before he left, he gave me his business card, saying that people with my skills and training would always be in demand. When the problems with my wife became unbearable, and I realized there was no going back, I called the number on that golden business card. They set up a meeting, and within a month, I embarked on my first business trip. By the time it ended, my bank account had increased significantly. I lived a full life while my wife entangled herself with Bidim. I didn't care at all. I had my own matters to attend to, frequently disappearing from home and earning illicit money. I was the master of my destiny, indifferent to the reality around me. I was tired of my love, exhausted from the suffering. I was burned out from the inside. That's what happens when someone constantly tramples on you. I won't dwell on female infidelity here, women come in all kinds. But I ended up with one like that. I don't know what Samantha hoped to achieve by humiliating me in front of her lover, her family, and her colleagues, but I must admit she did it quite skillfully. The only ones I felt sorry for were the children. Ultimately, though, I had no intention of taking anything away from them, not even their mother. So, what happened there? Yevgeny Vasilev asked his daughter while sipping his brandy. I don't know, Dad. When I approached, Vadim was writhing in pain on the ground, and everyone was shouting and calling for an ambulance, Samantha replied hesitantly. She glanced at her mother before quickly diverting her eyes back to her father. Since childhood, she had been afraid of him and tried to avoid his gaze. Even now, that fear lingered. And where was your husband? Her father asked sternly. He was there too, as usual, sitting on the bench, Samantha answered with disdain. And he was supposed to help his wife's lover? Yevgeny Vasilev looked at her with scorn. How would I know? Samantha retorted. Everyone's talking about this. Are you completely out of your mind? What did you ever see in that smug idiot Vadim? When did your husband stop being enough for you? Her father's irritated voice seemed to fill the room, echoing off the high ceiling. Dad, John isn't capable of jealousy. He can't stand up for himself, I'm telling you, I've studied him over time, Samantha said, pouring herself a small glass of brandy but not drinking it. You studied him? And where is he now? Why isn't he by your side? I went to the hospital with Vadim. When I got back, John was already gone, Samantha explained, pulling out her iPhone and dialing her husband's number. His phone was turned off, her father shook his head in anger. Where is he now? And where does he keep disappearing to? Vasilev asked, his voice calm but filled with authority, rising once more to the high ceiling. He takes unpaid leave, or rather, he used to, Samantha said, avoiding his gaze. What do you mean, used to? He asked sharply, raising his head. I fired him. He was becoming too bold, she admitted, unsure of how to justify herself. So, you've just called yourself stupid. Samantha lowered her head in shame. When you started dating John, I tried to learn more about him. You know I have connections, but no one could find anything. Only one person, someone who works in a highly classified government agency, told me to stop asking questions about John because he's dangerous. Her father raised a finger for emphasis. And here you are, telling me he's weak. Samantha looked at her father, now filled with fear. I have the impression my daughter is a fixable fool, Yevgeny Vasilev said, rising to his feet, signaling it was time for Samantha to leave. Far away, Jersa thought he could hear the roar of a helicopter's engine. The sound grew louder, drawing closer. No, it wasn't an illusion. Above his head, blocking out the stars, a swift, predatory machine approached. The helicopter tilted sharply, then turned back toward the battle site. Jersa knew why the pilots hesitated, refraining from opening fire. From his gear, he pulled out a metal tube and soon launched a red flare, marking his position. The helicopter made another pass, and two blue streaks shot from its underside, missiles. Two bursts of fire and the thunder of explosions followed. Fragments of rocky material flew in all directions. Era took cover behind a large stone to shield himself from the flying debris. His mind was blank as he lay pressed to the ground, tears streaming down his cheeks. He muttered a single word on autopilot, ours. Jersa cautiously poked his head out from cover. The helicopter was still circling, its silhouette barely visible, clearly trying to identify its next target. Before he could determine what had happened, a bright projectile streaked toward the rotorcraft. It was easy to see the missile strike the hull and embed itself in the armor. Moments later, the sound of an explosion reached Jersa. The helicopter, now ablaze, spun violently before skidding down the rocky slope, breaking apart as it collided with the jagged rocks. Finally, the wreckage crashed into the gorge, followed by the deafening echo of another explosion. The question of whether the pilots had survived didn't even arise. A resonant silence followed. Jersa, however, knew the enemy was still close. Lying in wait, he tossed a small stone to the side. Almost instantly, a shot rang out, and a bullet struck a rock just a few meters away, scattering sharp fragments. Despite the danger, Jirsa managed to identify the source of the shot. At that moment, a cloud obscured the moon, plunging the plateau into total darkness. Like a serpent slithering between the rocks, he crept closer to the enemy, who remained motionless, blending into the terrain like a predator lying in ambush. In his right hand, Jirsa gripped a tactical knife. Shooting the bandit would have been simpler and safer, but he wanted to feel the final moments, the enemy's last breath leaving his body. Taking a deep breath of the cold mountain air, Jirsa sprang forward, delivering a precise, fatal strike to the heart. The bandit had no time to react and barely offered any resistance. After the man's body went still, Jirsa wiped his knife on the enemy's jacket, then paused in silence. The moon reappeared, shedding its indifferent light over the battlefield. Jirsa tilted his head and ran a hand over his neck. Yes, there was blood, but his head wasn't hurting, which meant the injury was just a graze. Ignoring the scratches, he stood up, adjusted his gear, and reached into the chest pocket of his jacket, finding the textured grip of his pistol. He returned the knife to its sheath and scanned his surroundings, using the snow-dusted rocks to orient himself. Jirsa began descending the slope, which was mostly gentle but occasionally steep. The weather was worsening. A gust of icy wind drove leaden clouds across the sky, once again concealing the timid moon. A fine, irritating rain started to fall. Wrapped in the damp fog, Jirsa pulled his hood over his head and continued his slow descent into the valley. The deteriorating weather was timely. In such conditions, bandits were unlikely to maintain high vigilance. And really, what vigilance could there be when visibility was no more than 3 meters? An alarm clock rang, accompanied by the beep of a laptop. A new email had arrived. Stretching, I logged into my account securely. Well, just a little more to go. A final goodbye to my wife, her blood-sucking father, and society, and then I'll quietly disappear into a new life. These thoughts lifted my mood. Humming something from the Beatles, I slipped into my old slippers and went to the bathroom. I stared at myself in the mirror for a while. The question of shaving didn't even cross my mind. My 3-day stubble fit perfectly with my image of a loser. I brushed my teeth and scratched my head. I look like a monkey, I thought. But for some reason, women like burying their faces in my curly hair. What do they find attractive about that? Well, that's their decision. That I emptied the remainder of an expensive cologne over my shaved head, put on a stretched-out t-shirt, and returned to the computer. The phone next to it was ringing insistently, but I didn't care. The world can wait while I get ready. That I threw on a nearly black jacket over the t-shirt, slipped into black jeans, and glanced in the mirror. A complete look, a loser in all his glory. Good enough. The phone screeched again, sounding like an out-of-tune siren. Where have you disappeared to? My wife squawked like an annoyed hen. What happened? I asked, though I honestly couldn't care less. There's a board meeting in an hour. Dad wants you to be there, Samantha said, her voice betraying a hint of guilt. I hope you haven't forgotten that I no longer work at your company, I replied, even yawning a bit for emphasis. John, don't be ridiculous, Samantha tried to chatter on, as if afraid I might hang up. I'll think about it. I hung up, got into my car, and quietly drove away from the factory grounds. Feeling hungry, I stopped at a small, long-forgotten cafe. The neon sign was missing 2 letters, giving the place a mysteriously glamorous touch. Pushing the door open, I was enveloped by the familiar aroma of a public cafe. The plump waitress, lost in her thoughts, took my order, and I settled into a corner to wait for my coffee. But before I could fully immerse myself in the ambience, my phone buzzed. John, a woman has called you several times, asking for your mobile number, said the secretary from the department where I had worked so diligently until recently. Her voice was perfectly modulated. Who is this woman, and what does she want? I asked, almost laughing. Victoria Sakina. She said it's a personal matter, the secretary replied, her voice tinged with curiosity. Give her my number, I said, my mood souring. The woman's last name meant nothing to me, but her first name stirred an old memory. When I entered the orphanage, I found myself in a completely different world, a sort of wonderland, but one where it was me against everyone else. They beat me at every opportunity, without needing any reason. The nights were particularly hard, I genuinely feared sleep. Asking the teachers or supervisors for protection was useless. Gradually, the tension in my character built up, like a tightly wound spring. One day during recess, they dragged me into an empty classroom and began their disciplinary session. But something went wrong. I pulled out a knife I had made from an old file during shop class and struck with all my strength. I injured one of them in the thigh and hit another in the shoulder, incapacitating him. Facing the third one was simple. I kicked him hard, yelled, threw him to the ground, and methodically began kicking him, aiming for his face. Hearing the commotion, the teachers burst into the room and witnessed a scene worthy of a horror film. After that, things got interesting. The police were called, stern men and women, but they couldn't send me to prison. I was too young. Instead, I got a severe talking to and was allowed to stay at the boarding school. However, the reputation of being a psychopath stuck with me. They left me alone, and I began to live as if in a void, interacting with no one. There was an intriguing figure at the boarding school, a janitor who also served as the night watchman. He wore a camouflage jacket and had a prosthetic left leg. Despite that, he was never discouraged. He would hum to himself while sweeping the schoolyard and keeping watch at night. He lived in a small basement room on campus. That was how I connected with him. He captivated me with stories about his life, about Africa and the exotic countries he had visited. I listened, wide-eyed and fascinated. But as I grew older, I started to doubt him. It seemed like my adult friend might have been pulling my leg. Still, I kept going to his room in the afternoons. We would prepare tea, and he would tell me another story. He never spoke about his personal life. Sometimes, in the middle of a story, he would fall silent for a few minutes. His face would grow severe, his cheekbones prominent, and he would seem like a stranger, someone entirely different. Then, the moment would pass, and he would return to his usual self. Once, during one of those silences, he said to me, "Remember, child, for a man, honor is the most important thing. Don't fear defeat, it's temporary. Your time will come. But if you lose your honor, you'll never get it back, no matter how hard you try. Remember, there are concepts like love and loyalty. They're not separate things. Love is loyalty. Without loyalty, there's no love." My friend sighed deeply and then shifted to a lighter topic, telling me something cheerful. He passed away during my final year at the school. At his funeral, people in military uniforms stood alongside a grieving woman dressed in black. I clearly remember the small cushions adorned with numerous medals. An hour later, GSA emerged onto a barely visible mountain trail. After walking a few meters, he decided to rest. Suddenly, he heard footsteps and conversation around the bend. A group of people was coming along the path. He realized that, besides bandits, no one else could possibly be traveling there. GSA drew his Stechkin pistol and stepped to the side, but it was too late. They had spotted him. There were 4 of them. 3 of them appeared to be locals, 2 were around 20 years old, and the third, slightly older, was presumably their leader. The fourth figure, was a woman dressed in rags that barely covered her frail, neglected body. Her hands were tied behind her back, and a rope around her neck was used to lead her like an animal. They stopped, exchanging puzzled glances at the sight of an unfamiliar man in faded camouflage. "Stop," the older man ordered, standing about 5 meters away from GSA. The others, standing a little behind him, clearly relied on their leader for direction. GSA pulled the trigger twice. The 9mm bullets pierced through the man's coat, and he was thrown backward, dropping his rifle, which clattered against the rocks. One of the younger men turned to flee but was knocked down. GSA raised his pistol again, firing several precise shots. When it was over, he lowered his weapon and scanned the area, his eyes landing on the bound woman. "Come here," he commanded, motioning with his right hand, which still held the pistol. "Don't be afraid." She approached cautiously, trembling with fear and cold, though it was evident she was more afraid of disobeying. GSA tucked the pistol into his jacket pocket and pulled out a knife. "Turn around," he instructed. With a quick motion, he cut through the ropes binding her hands. "Who are you?" he asked. She recoiled slightly, as though expecting to be struck, and remained silent. Perhaps she didn't understand English. It was then that GSA recognized her, his mother. She hadn't changed at all. The same carefully maintained face with its perpetual look of discontent. Her slender body was tanned, likely from months of harsh conditions. The scene shifted. I scanned the room, searching for her. "Mom, I'm here," I called out, standing and raising my hand. "John," she said skeptically, scrutinizing my face. "You've changed so much." Apparently, my appearance disappointed her. Her gaze lingered on my t-shirt and jeans. "What do you want from me?" I asked directly, skipping any pleasantries. Her voice wavered. "Jan is very sick. She urgently needs a bone marrow transplant." Tears welled up in her eyes. "You're the only one who can help her. She needs your blood. Please, I beg you, help her." She was almost sobbing. For some reason, I remembered the girl in the revealing outfit who had disdainfully thrown candy at my feet, and the indifferent back of my mother walking away from the orphanage's closed door that I couldn't think clearly. I stood up silently and left the cafe. The door of my Lexus closed with a soft click. The shocked expression on my mother's face, who had followed me outside, was the last thing I saw in my rearview mirror. Jersa picked up the rifle from the fallen man and inspected his surroundings. Another rifle lay a short distance away. He grabbed it by the strap and checked it. Removing the magazine, he found it fully loaded. He pulled the bolt several times. Everything moved smoothly. Removing the receiver cover, he examined the spring and gas piston, which were well oiled. It was clear this AKM hadn't been fired in a long time. Jersa reassembled the rifle, reinserted the magazine, and checked its functionality. He then took 2 more loaded magazines from the pockets of the fallen commander and placed them in his bag. This should be enough, he thought. Turning to the woman, he saw her sitting hunched over, afraid to move. Jersa pulled out a chocolate bar and handed it to her. "Eat," he instructed. After a moment's thought, he took a jacket from one of the bandits and tossed it to her. "Put it on," he said. She obediently put on the jacket. They needed to leave quickly. Gunshots in the mountains carried far, and it was possible a group of armed men was already heading their way for revenge. Jersa slung the rifle over his shoulder and gently nudged the reluctant woman forward. "Let's go," he said. He figured the rebels hadn't walked the entire way. They had likely driven, which meant there had to be a road nearby, and their vehicle was probably parked there. They had either bought or kidnapped the woman and were taking her back to their village. The customs here were brutally simple to the point of absurdity. Might makes right, and the one holding the weapon was always correct. After about half an hour, they reached a road. On one side, the road pressed against the cliffs, while on the other, the sound of a mountain river echoed from the depths of a gorge. As they approached, a white Toyota with rust stains was parked near the cliffs. The doors were open, and the key was still in the ignition, exactly as one would expect in a place where theft wasn't a concern. Here, everyone knew each other, everyone was family. Jersa climbed into the driver's seat, tossing the rifle into the back. He opened the passenger door and motioned for the woman to get in. Though he hadn't determined if she understood English, she followed his instruction, sitting obediently in the front seat. Starting the engine, Jersa turned the car around and headed toward what he believed was a government military checkpoint. Night fell completely, but Jersa refrained from turning on the headlights. The moon occasionally emerged from behind the clouds, casting faint light on the road. The car crept forward slowly, as though dragging itself, prepared for any unexpected eventuality. They drove for a while. Gradually, dawn began to break, replacing the night's darkness with a dense gray fog that wrapped around the road. Jirsa stopped the car and opened the door, listening carefully. Somewhere ahead, he heard a dog barking, likely signaling the presence of a settlement. Military checkpoints were usually located at village entrances. Realizing they needed to abandon the car and continue on foot, Jirsa gestured for the woman to get out. Then, grabbing his rifle, he began walking down the road, not looking back, knowing she wouldn't stay behind. Visibility was nearly non-existent. At one point, he stumbled over a concrete slab lying in the middle of the road. Clearly, there was a checkpoint ahead. Jirsa called out several times, hesitant to fire a shot, knowing it might provoke reckless gunfire. Finally, someone responded in the local language. Recalling a few key phrases, Jirsa managed to explain who he was. Two soldiers emerged from the fog, each armed with rifles. Jirsa carefully placed his AKM on the concrete and raised his hands. At that moment, a loud thud sounded behind him. Something heavy struck his back, and Jirsa's surroundings plunged into a viscous, sticky darkness. A knock on the compartment door woke him up. "We're arriving," the driver's voice echoed near his ear. Jirsa opened his eyes. The train was now entering the suburbs of a large city, and dawn was breaking outside. Raindrops, scattered by the wind and speed, danced in circles on the glass window. The compartment was empty. His fellow passengers had likely disembarked during the night. Jirsa squinted and smiled faintly as doors in neighboring compartments slammed shut. Slowly, he rotated his prosthetic leg, picked up his belongings, and scanned the area to ensure he hadn't forgotten anything before stepping into the narrow corridor of the sleeper car. The train slowed beneath the glass canopy of an old station and, with a slight jolt, came to a stop. The conductors quickly descended the steps, wiping the handrails. The handrails gleamed as people slowly disembarked from the train cars. Jirsa descended onto the platform, gripping the railings and limping slightly as he headed toward the exit. A cold northern wind blew, sending a swirl of fallen yellow leaves spinning toward him. Suddenly, Jirsa felt an inexplicable unease, as if the wind itself were trying to warn him of something. Tossing his cigarette butt into a trash can, he continued limping toward the bus stop. Jirsa reached the 4th floor and used his key to open the apartment door. The faint hum of a television could be heard from somewhere inside, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. He set down his bag and walked toward the kitchen. 2 cups of unfinished coffee sat on the table. For a moment, it felt as though Vera might walk into the kitchen at any second and everything would return to how it once was. From the bedroom, he heard a noise. Cautiously, Jirsa opened the door, and froze. His wife was kneeling in front of an unknown naked man, moving her head rhythmically. The scene was grotesque, a stark betrayal laid bare. The man's hand rested on the back of Vera's head, controlling her movements. His eyes were closed, and his face betrayed nothing but self-indulgent satisfaction. Vera seemed utterly absorbed, lost in her actions. Jirsa stood there for a moment, observing the scene with a detached sense of curiosity. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the hallway. From his bag, he pulled out a stun grenade. Carefully, he approached the bedroom once again. He didn't hesitate. To him, this was an invasion, and it needed to be dealt with decisively. Pulling the pin, he cracked the door open and tossed the grenade toward the bed. The occupants, lost in their shared moment, didn't notice. Jirsa managed to close the door just before the room was filled with a deafening bang and a blinding flash. A sharp, high-pitched male scream followed. When Jirsa re-entered the bedroom, Vera was lying unconscious on the floor. Her companion was curled into a ball near the bed, clutching his bloodied groin and groaning in agony, seemingly unaware of his surroundings. Careful to avoid stepping in the blood, Jirsa collected the remnants of the grenade and returned to the hallway. He opened a closet, pulled out a guitar, an old gift from his mother, picked up his bag, and left the apartment quickly. By the time he got into a taxi, he was confident no one had seen him. 6 months after the funeral of my friend, I was summoned to the orphanage director's office. Baikin Pavlovich, the director, bit his lip nervously for a long while before gesturing to a stranger seated at a small table. "This is John, the one himself," the director said, standing up and leaving me alone with the stranger. "Well, hello, the one himself," the man said, extending his hand to me. The handshake was firm and confident. "They call me, well, who cares about my name," he added with a disdainful smile. "Yuri asked me to give you this." He pulled a guitar case from behind the chair, placing it on the desk, followed by a set of keys. "These are for the motorcycle in the garage. Here are the documents." The stranger slid a leather wallet toward me. "You'll figure it out," he said casually, pulling a card from his breast pocket. "There's some cash in the account. Count it when you get the chance. The PIN code is 4111. The man stood up. "Don't worry. Everything will work out for you." He patted me on the shoulder and left the office. When I arrived at my father-in-law's company office, I clung to the hope that I wouldn't be allowed inside. To my surprise, I was identified by the head of security himself, who quickly escorted me to the conference room. Upon entering, I found the entire group already gathered. My father-in-law shot me a disapproving look but said nothing. That I sat near the wall, feigning indifference toward the proceedings. After all, I wasn't a board member, and I had no idea why I had been summoned. The main item on the agenda was the transfer of company management to my wife, Samantha. Her father would retain overall control but was ceding a portion of the shares to her. No one sought my input. My opinion didn't matter. After some time, the meeting ended, and everyone left except for Samantha and her father. "John, it's time we talked," my father-in-law said bluntly. "You saw that I've handed the company over to Samantha. She wants to appoint Bedim as manager. You know him, it's her prerogative. She also wants a divorce. I understand you have 2 children, but there's nothing to be done. You'll have to pay child support and participate in their upbringing as best you can." My father-in-law glanced at Samantha, who sat silently, not once turning her head in my direction. "So, that's how it is," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Fine. I don't think there will be any problem raising the kids." I placed 2 documents with official seals in front of my father-in-law. "What's this?" he asked, picking them up and trying to read them. "The results of DNA paternity tests," I said calmly. "Neither child is mine. It's best if their biological father takes care of them." I turned to Samantha with disdain. "It's Bedim, isn't it, dear?" She flinched at the question, her face flushing red. "I've already filed for divorce." "You'll end up with nothing, left out in the cold," I added. "My lawyers will ensure you don't take advantage of me anymore." Samantha's once beautiful face twisted with fury. She was visibly trembling with anger, as though waiting for the right moment to explode. 2 young men entered the conference room. "These are my lawyers," I said. "They'll handle the divorce." My father-in-law wiped his sweaty brow with a handkerchief, as if he had been dreading this moment all along. The lawyers approached me from all sides, trying to maintain an air of professionalism. "Mr. Lehman," one of them began, "your spouse has filed for divorce and property division. If you wish, you can invite your own lawyer," one of the young men said with a mocking smile. "Let it be," he continued. "We represent your wife's interests in the divorce case against you. We thought we might be able to reach a private agreement rather than fight it out in court. Are you absolutely sure you don't want to bring in your lawyer? Why bother?" "I have no intention of disputing anything," I replied, glancing at my father-in-law. The poor man was sweating heavily. I couldn't understand what he was so afraid of. The lawyer pulled a voice recorder out of his briefcase. "Do you mind if I record our conversation?" "I don't mind," I said. Unbeknownst to them, I pressed a button on a small device in my pocket. Let's determine your assets, Mr. Lehman, the lawyer said, looking at my wife. According to your wife, you own 2 cars, a motorcycle, the house where you live with your wife and children, as well as bank accounts. The motorcycle and the house were mine before the marriage, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. We're aware of that, the lawyer responded. However, over the years, your wife contributed financially to the repairs for the motorcycle and, consequently, the house. There are corresponding documents for this. He handed me a pile of receipts. Oh, so she had planned to deceive me all along, I thought. The thing is, neither the house nor the motorcycle belongs to me, I said. They belong to a friend, I'm just using them. Your wife believes both the house and the motorcycle belong to you, or at least, she has never claimed otherwise throughout your life together, the lawyer said. What she thinks doesn't matter much, I replied. For nearly 15 years, I thought she loved me too. Look where that got me. Hiding assets is a crime, the lawyer said, taking off his glasses and beginning to clean them. I assume you verified that the house and motorcycle belong to someone else. I asked. To a friend of a friend, actually, who kindly allows me to live there and use the motorcycle. Can you name the owner? The lawyer asked, his confidence waning. Unfortunately, I don't know him personally. But I'd advise against bothering him too much, he's quite sensitive. I looked at the lawyers with feigned sympathy. Fine, the lawyer said. But can you confirm the presence of the cars? If my dear wife had taken the time to investigate, I said, she would have discovered that I don't own a single car. They all belong to the Special Forces Veterans Association. I simply use and maintain them. We'd like to clarify who owns the cars, the lawyer insisted. My eyes turned cold as I fixed my gaze on him. Do you really want answers to your questions? I asked icily. The room fell silent. The lawyer glanced questioningly at my father-in-law, whose head was bowed. He seemed to be starting to understand something. I wouldn't recommend probing the association with such questions, I continued with a polite smile. They don't take kindly to excessive curiosity. One of the lawyers retrieved the voice recorder, rewound the tape, and pressed play. White noise emanated from the speaker. I pulled a small box from my pocket, a rather convenient device. It interfered with all video and audio equipment within a 50-meter radius. I found it amusing and turned to Samantha. You won't get anything, my dear, I said calmly. I won't rush to take this to court. Somewhere in me, there's still a small remnant of love for you. But if I were you, I'd do everything possible to avoid crossing paths with me again. I glanced at my sweaty father-in-law. I'm leaving. And I suggest you leave me alone. Don't bring trouble upon yourself, I warned. That I stood and made my way toward the door, but as I approached, 2 security guards entered. For some reason, I wasn't surprised. Life doesn't teach fools anything. Before anyone could react, the 2 young guards hit the ground almost simultaneously, knocking over a couple of chairs in the process. Who else wants to take a chance? I asked, scanning the room. No one seemed eager. Catching Samantha's shocked and bewildered expression, I strode quickly toward the elevators. Idiots, I muttered under my breath. I could already imagine their faces tomorrow morning when they discovered their accounts emptied. Brushing aside the leaves blown by the wind, I carefully placed a bouquet of scarlet carnations on the black granite slab. The cemetery was quiet. Even the autumn wind seemed to make an effort not to disturb the departed. That I couldn't leave without saying goodbye to my friend. For a while, I stood in silence, staring at the marble obelisk adorned with a star, my eyes brimming with tears. Men cry too, I thought. Rest in peace, brother. May the earth be kind to you, I murmured. The motorcycle started with a single turn of the key, and soon the gray ribbon of the road stretched beneath its wheels. Recently harvested fields and patches of forest dotted with red and yellow leaves sped by on either side. That I knew exactly where I was going. The road ahead led toward the sun. A donation of $10 million has been made to the Republican Pediatric Oncology Clinic. The name of the donor could not be determined.